So thank you for joining us, Charles.
Thank you.
Please, Charles M. Blow. Charles, I'm going to start with what might be a curious point, which is there's a lot in the news about fraternities.
Right.
And in particular, at Grambling State, you pledged at a fraternity and described in what I thought was excruciating detail the painful and horrendous hazing you went through. And I want to know why you did it. And also, what is it about these hazing rituals that are meant to create bonds of solidarity?
This is the first discussion I ever had where a person started with that question, actually. Well, it wasn't something that I ever thought that that I wanted to do or that was attractive to me. It was I went to college and I ran for freshman class president and I won, and so it meant that I had to hang out with all the other class presidents all the time. And it was something that they all wanted to do. And these were the only people I knew, and basically the only people I knew, and I hung out with them all the time. And I said, okay, if this is good enough for you, fine, I'll do it too. And that was pretty much my concept of it. But it is, the whole culture of it is a very strange culture, and I wanted to spend some time with that, in which reviewers have, go one way or the other on that. Either they think it's too much of it, or they're fascinated by it. I wanted to spend a lot of time on it because I didn't think that people were treating it soberly, and that there were so many children and young adults who were engaging in activities like this. It's high school, it's family, it's, the hazing is a kind of societal poison that kind of goes across all kind of dimensions. And it's the military, it is professional groups, and this idea that you have to somehow create a trauma to create a bonding is an incredible idea. And then to think that no one is discussing this in a sober way, and to think that there are whole generations of Americans who are coming into being and into being the leaders of our society, who have basically been nurtured by brutality, is an incredible idea. And for me, I wanted to kind of pull the curtain back on that a bit and show that there is nothing glamorous about that. There is, there's nothing sexy about it. I mean, that people really do kind of try to make it into a glamorous thing and a rite of passage and kind of a testing of one's mettle. But in fact, it is just a visitation of cruelty from one body onto another. And there is no way to hold yourself harmless when you are in the commission of cruelty, that you surrender a bit of yourself every time you are cruel to another human being. And I wanted to convey that as best I could.
Good. Can I hang with that for a moment? Because it's interesting how your strength and perseverance through this hazing and that final hell week earned you the respect of the brothers in the fraternity, and who foisted you into a leadership role.
Right.
What did you make coming out of the tunnel of that? In other words, did that seem like a personal achievement, or did it seem like a mixed blessing?
Well, of course, in the middle of it, I mean, you have to remember that it is an incredible traumatic thing. You're not even thinking like yourself. By the time you're finished with that much scarring, both psychological and physical scarring, you're no longer even yourself. You can't even think straight. You can't even remember who you were before you were part of that. And so, yes, you take some perverse pride in being able to survive, not registering that should never have been a mechanism for inclusion in the first place.
Yeah. I was at the University of Oklahoma in the wake of the posting of the video by Sigma Alpha Epsilon about that racist chant on the bus. And what I was taken by the conversation there is that, first of all, it seemed pretty positive because on the front end, a lot of people didn't say, this is an isolated incident. This is the result of a few bad apples. Not reflective of what goes on here. Nobody said that. But by the same token, it was very difficult for folks to have a conversation, students and faculty, about the structural aspects of racism on the campus, or the kinds of microaggressions that students of color experience every day. And what makes that setting, or any setting, really difficult to get beyond these surface manifestations, these dramatic acts of racism?
I mean, do you mean what makes the fraternity setting or the collegiate
college
setting?
The college setting, any setting almost, that oftentimes we're really drawn to these kinds of very dramatic acts. You know, racial violence, racist chant.
I think we're still kind of dealing with kind of discrimination as if it has to be articulated. Mm-hmm. That it has to be an absolute clear manifestation, rather than to understand that biases exist in ways that are much more subtle than that they needn't be articulated nor constant, that we needn't even be aware that we possess the bias and that it is coming out of us. And in fact, a lot of the testing around this is about implicit bias. People thinking that they are completely egalitarian, believing that they have been this way their entire lives, they have operated in that way, they can point out all of the many different kinds of friends they have. They believe that they have no bias whatsoever, and then those tests reveal that they do have them. And in fact, the tests also reveal that we are all submerged in the same societal poisons of perception, that even I can have biases against people who look exactly like me or who identify in exactly the same way as I do, which kind of blows apart this idea that it must be opposites to which we hold biases against, and that it is a very subtle and sophisticated way that it moves through the society and moves through us as individuals. And the second part of that, I think, that I don't think that what people talk enough about is the kind of group mentality of kind of pain, suffering, exclusion, and hatred. That I can completely imagine that not everyone singing that chant thought it was okay. And yet, when we operate in groups that are designed to exclude, which is what fraternities are, mm-hmm. designed to exclude, then you kind of fall into the kind of pack mentality of doing things that you may not, on an individual level, on a human level, have thought appropriate. Mm-hmm. And it takes a tremendous amount of kind of courage and self-awareness to, in those moments, pull away and say, this is not okay. And to confront the group, to confront the pack, and say, I won't take part in that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, these conversations, as I said, on this campus were strained. I was sort of thinking on a national scale. Back in 1997, President Clinton tried to initiate a conversation, a dialogue on race that sort of floundered in the wake of the Monica Lewinsky scandal. And recently we have Starbucks on their Race Together initiative. So what would a real serious, from your perspective, what would a more serious kind of national dialogue about race look like? What kinds of things would it have to take up? Certainly you were mentioning things around implicit bias and how we're all subject to kinds of poisonous ideas which circulate. But how do we move forward? What would a dialogue look like?
Well, I actually believe that we are having it. People often say we need to have, I try to remind people that we are in the middle of that conversation. But what we envision the conversation to be, which is a universal kind of equal part acceptance of blame and guilt and responsibility, that may not be the shape of the conversation that people imagine in their minds. And the acknowledgement of privilege on the one hand and oppression on the other may not be the contours of the conversation that we imagine in our mind, the utopian conversation we imagine in our mind. But people are in fact having conversations about this issue all the time. I think that what ends up happening though is that all conversations around bias end up being conversations largely of the aggrieved talking to the aggrieved rather than the people who are doing the aggrieved taking full participatory role in those conversations. And that part becomes a kind of a disappointment for people. I've had, you had a tremendous number of conversations and done a lot of speeches about race, and and those audiences are filled with people who look a lot like me. And I keep thinking to myself, when this is in the South they say this is preaching to the choir. Yeah. This is not just about you and I. It is about all of us. Toni Morrison says, she turns race into a verb. She says, if I am raced, then you are raced. That if race is a construct, then you are constructed. And if the only way you are able to say that you find value in yourself is in juxtaposition to me, then that means, what does it mean when you take me out? Take me out of the equation. And then, are you still tall enough? Are you still smart enough? Are you still strong enough? Find you in this racial paradigm, because you are also constructed, if I am.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very good. When you were a college student, a Dean's List student, and a freshman class president, no less, you and your friend Brandon were coming back from a convenience store when you were stopped by a police officer. Right. Tell us what happened there.
So there were a bunch of us college kids, and we were at a house right down the street from the convenience store, and we left all at once, and maybe there were 5 or 6 cars, and we all pulled into the convenience store and went in and got college kid snack things, chips and sodas or whatever. And we came back out, and there was a police cruiser parked out beyond the gas stations, the gas pumps, and we didn't think anything of it. We have chips. And we all pulled out, and our car was the last one to pull out in caravan, because we were in a town called Ruston. In the South, this still exists to this day, but it's how it kind of sprang up. Everything was segregated in the big decades ago, and so every place there was a historically white college, right next to it, a few miles away, would be a historically black college, right? So our college is in Grambling. This place is in Ruston, 3 miles apart. Most people lived in Ruston because it was bigger, had more apartment stock. And so we're driving back to Grambling's campus, and the cop pulls up behind our car, and we realize there's a police officer following closely behind us. So we're trying to make sure you're driving the speed limit, make sure you don't do anything weird. And before we get out of the city limits, the lights come on. And he directs us to turn right, and we turn right into the subdivision, and he gets out, and he asks for, comes to the window, asks for a license registration, and my friend's asking me, why did you stop us? And he goes, you turned without a signal. Well, there was no turn until he told us to turn. So I go into the glove box, and because I'm sitting on the passenger side, to get the license registration, and I open it, and one of these, I don't know if you remember these things. So you remember switchblade combs? This thing, you win them at the county fair, yeah. Right? The funds used to have it. You pat and do this, So this switchblade comb from the county fair rolls out onto the glove box opening, and I go, oh my God, why do you have a switchblade? And then I realized, oh no, this is a comb. So. And I'm, young kid, stupid, 18 years old. I'm like, this is funny. And I click it, and it pops open, and it's a comb. And I'm thinking, see? And he's like, no, see? And he pulls this weapon. And my hands reflexively go up, and he orders Brandon out of the car, and Brandon's still, trying to demand why was he stopped, and the cop says, this is Brandon's retelling of it, that he said that I could lie you down in the middle of the street and shoot you in the back of the head and nobody would ask me anything. And he turned and he went back to his car and he pulled away. And Brandon's back in the car and we're just, we can't process that this is happening because, we're like scholarship kids. Like we're the good guys. We can't process it. His father was a professor at the school. So, we're steaming. We don't know what to do. So we go to his father's house, and his father, who's grown up in Louisiana his whole life and has had to deal with this sort of issue his whole life, he says, "Are you okay?" And he says, "Yes. What are we going to do?" And his father says, "We're not going to do anything." And that was the way that people like him, people who look like us, survived in that part of the world. And so today to see people saying enough is enough is really a stirring moment for me. And I've been writing a lot about it because I know that pain personally, and to have had to go through the humiliation of being subjected to it, and then to have his father basically say that we couldn't even fight back was hard.
A couple of months ago, your son Taj, who's a student at Yale University, was approached by a Yale University police officer who drew his gun and ordered Taj to the ground. Sometimes you think about your experiences and that of your sons and sort of wearily conclude that maybe nothing ever changes, that what you've done matters less than what you look like?
Well, that's exactly, that's the line that I wrote, which is that in those moments, that is the truth. When they pull a gun, you can't pull a resume, right? You can't say, oh, no, but I'm a third year chemistry major. You can't say that. In those moments, it is, you look like someone we're looking for and I need you on the ground and I have a gun. And there's an incredible sadness to that, to know that there is this intergenerational trauma tumbles forward. For me personally, in my own family, but in general in society, that it continues to tumble forward from one generation to the next, from Brandon's dad to Brandon, from me to my son. It shouldn't be.
Yeah, well, we're still faced, though, and you've chronicled this a lot in your columns, about this huge gap in perception by race, about confidence in the police, about whether or not the criminal justice system is racially biased. How do you think about that huge gap? And how do you think a conversation could occur that would at least address those kinds of real differences in perception?
Well, part of the perception is just experiential, right? That there are people who have actual experiences who, my brother is a town barber in my small town. Go into a black barbershop and see if you can find anybody in there who hasn't had an experience like the one that I'm describing. That means that, people are having, this is not just a perception issue. This is, I have had this happen. I don't want this to happen to you. Dave Chappelle has this great skit about police brutality. You should Google this, YouTube it, and the idea that, people don't quite understand it and don't want to accept that this is part of the black male experience. And, he says, every black man I know is a qualified paralegal because they know every single crime and every single the kind of punishment for every single crime because you don't want to get caught up in it, right? And that's a real thing. But I do believe that what ends up happening is that we use statistics around criminality to create mythologies around race, right? And so the percentage of people who are engaged in any sort of violent crime is minuscule. And yet to extrapolate the demography of those violent criminals onto whole races of people and say, well, the people are more likely to look like you who are criminals, therefore anything that we do to you in your community, you are just collateral damage. We're trying to go after the 2, 3, 4% of violent criminals, so the 96% of you who are just trying to make it to school, just trying to make it home, just trying to make it to your job, no matter what I do to you, you are collateral damage. That's an extraordinary thing to say to people, and it is an incredibly damaging thing to do psychically to people, to make people kind of process the idea that there is a skin tax. And the other weird thing about that demography is that a lot of it's FBI data, but the FBI data is very slim because one thing that the FBI does not include in its data, it relies very heavily on race because that's one of the metrics that they track. They do not track the other, probably more influential aspect of criminality, which is concentrated poverty, right? So it's not necessarily that I am genetically predisposed to criminality because I am black, which is racist on its face. And the fact, every time, if you ever see me on television, somebody saying that, I'm like biting my tongue half in two, like I can't even take it, because you do realize that what you have just said there is a genetic inference, which is a race-based inference. And any scientist would tell you, anthropologists would tell you, there is no biological basis for race whatsoever. In fact, I am more likely to have more in common genetically with somebody who is white than with another person who is black, biologically and genetically. There is no basis for it whatsoever. It's just, I have darker skin because people who were in my lineage grew up, were in hotter climates. The hair is curlier because they had to retain water to cool the body. If you were in a colder place, the hair had to be straighter because if you were dumped into a pool of water and it's freezing, you have to release that water as quickly as possible. These are just kind of adaptations to climate. Has nothing to do with predispositions to criminality and so when people start along that line, you have to say, I always say like, okay, then it would stand to reason that all of the rich black people would also be out killing people because it's predisposed, right? I don't see Magic Johnson's kids out killing people. Because you have to, if it is in fact a racial attribute, then you have to follow it. And if you can't follow it, then it falls apart.
You were pretty hopeful a few minutes ago. You were talking about how Brandon's dad said, there's nothing you can do about it. And you're thinking that now folks are able to mobilize around the issues, around to challenge it. What's your thoughts on where movements like Black Lives Matter is going?
Well, first, thank God for video phones. Yeah. I mean, Jesus. So I think part of it is really important just to drag this into the open and have people be confronted by it in a visual, visceral way so that you could no longer deny that it is happening. And now we're seeing a new video once every week or two. Yeah. The downside of that is that I also worry about the kind of repetition of seeing people's lives taken on live television. Yeah. And to see that 40 and 50 and 100 times, because there's something about the kind of video gameization, I just made that word up, video gameization, of seeing a life taken that devalues the act of taking the life. And so I there's something macabre and pornographic about it.
I was going to say pornographic.
And particularly since I've been in the news business my entire life, and I know that we make choices all the time about why we're not going to show a person's life being taken. And so people do not show the slitting of the neck of a hostage by ISIS, and we do not show, as a society, we have decided that we will not show executions when they're sanctioned by the state. But somehow, it is okay to show somebody's child being shot in the back 100 times.
So
what
was
there a question in there?
Yeah, there was a question
I think
in
I missed
there.
it. Okay.
So, yes, thank God for being able to record these things and to work against the kinds of narratives directly of the participants involved. But I was trying to get you to talk about a hopeful moment within this kind of mobilization and organizing.
Yes,
listen. In response to this kind of police
yes, that's the question.
violence.
I got it. I'm back on track now. All right. I absolutely believe that there is a hopeful side to this, because I do believe that we are, people all around the Selma celebration or the Selma anniversary, people kept saying, well, where's the next Martin Luther King? What's the future of the civil rights movement? And I keep trying to remind people, we are in the middle of a civil rights movement. It is around LGBT issues. It is around income inequality. It is around the environment. It is around racial issues. Kids are taking to the streets in droves constantly, and the fact that we can't see that we are in the middle of it because there is not one person who is directing it, that this is not a top-down but a bottom-up movement, that this is a crowd-sourced approach to social justice. And if you can't see that, it's problematic for you.
Let's talk a little bit about LGBTQ issues.
Yes.
You grew up with a young man named Lawrence who sort of flaunted his presumed gay sexuality. And later he said...
Or he was just himself.
He was just himself. Lawrence was just Lawrence.
I want to put it that, because it's not a flaunting to be you, right? It's just love yourself.
It's you. Okay. Good point. Point taken. So, but in growing up with him, you came to recognize just how much courage Lawrence possessed to live, as you say, and I'll quote you, outside the rules and ahead of his time in such a small place. Right. Well, Lawrence is later found tragically tied to a bed and murdered. And you contrast his death with that of Matthew Shepard 5 years later. And in your book you say that, you just simply state this, that the discrepancy in the responses to those two murders would continue to haunt you. Right. How did it haunt you?
Well, I think what it revealed to me was the intersectionality of a lot of issues, including race and the LGBT community. I think that people think that one aggrieved group, if you are part of an aggrieved group or historically aggrieved group, then you are somehow immune to being abusive yourself. Or immune to the idea that you could be infected by bias of another sort, right? That when you get to the LGBT community, therefore, that race disappears. In fact, that is not the truth. And in fact, James Baldwin was very eloquent about this idea, that race stalked him into the LGBT community. Mm-hmm. And that it was not completely inclusive across the board. And this idea of me looking at what's happening and the value of this black body of a man in a small town killed because of his sexuality, and the value of this young white man's body from a small town who is killed because of his sexuality, and one is international news and one barely shows up in the local newspaper, is a jarring contrast for me and is a constant reminder that it is not completely equitable across the board, and that there is still that bias that stalks you even across aggrieved groups.
I actually want to continue on this line of thought, but I also want to invite the audience, if they have any questions that they like to ask Charles Blow, that maybe we could collect some cards, if possible. And we may be able to take 2 or 3 questions. But I want to still dwell with you on this topic. You know, in coming of age as a young man, you sort of grappled with deep contradictions and ambivalences about your own sexuality. I mean, you were attracted to women, but you were also, in ways, sometimes you wanted to suppress or deny, attracted to men. Think about what it made for you how to reconcile or transcend these conflicted feelings. And the other part of this, which I really like, is you say in the book that the word bisexual is, quote, woefully inadequate and impressionistically inaccurate. I'd like to hear about that.
Right, so that's the 21-year-old talking, right? I'm in the moment there. But I mean, I think that what people end up thinking about bisexuality, first of all, you have to, with any identity, you have to stop thinking of it as a contradiction. You have to stop thinking of it as a conflict and just embrace that it is, that the truth of you is whatever that is. And you can love yourself wholly and truly. And in fact, you have a moral obligation to yourself to love yourself, right? You have to, that's the first part of that. But the second part of it is that bisexuality is such a confusing thing for people to grasp because they think that it can only be one thing, that you are on the 50-yard line making mad dashes at both goal posts, right? And maybe that is the truth for some people, but it is not the truth for everyone, and that there are many, many shades of what it means to be bisexual in the world. And some people can be, you know, I talked to one professor who wrote a column about this a long time ago. He said, like, the burgeoning area of his research is people, young men who say they are mostly straight, right? That they enjoy sex with women, they've pretty much only had sex with women, but the right night, a couple of beers, maybe, you know, who knows what's gonna happen. So, but the idea that there can be a lopsided sense of sexuality, and the idea that it's not necessarily fixed, but it floats for some people, is really hard for people to understand. And I think that what that sentence was trying to say is that we have to get away from the idea that it is fixed and it is perfectly in the middle, and that there's a million shades and a million ways to be, and all of them are perfectly okay.
And Lawrence was Lawrence.
Lawrence was Lawrence.
You know, the political responses to Indiana's Religious Freedom Restoration Act has certainly been an intriguing one. I'm going to quote you on a column. You've written, quote, while it is heartening to see these corporations rushing to voice their opposition to the measure, there is still something about it that feels slightly out of kilter, a moral issue being driven by consumerism considerations, end of quote. I'm going to ask you, what bothered you about Walmart, Apple, Eli Lilly, Angie's List, opposition to the bill, and what would a more moral or principled response to that law look like?
No, I mean, I don't have a problem with them. With them doing what they're doing, but I do understand that is driven by profit considerations, right? And all of the people who have always campaigned and protested against measures like this do not get the same response that an Apple and a Walmart get, right? And those lawmakers were shaking in their boots when they thought that there may be a reduction in the tax base. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They were not shaking in their boots because they thought that people would be hurt by it, right? Mm-hmm. That is my moral issue with it, because I think the response should be human. It should not be corporate.
And what would that look like? What would the human response look like?
The human response would have been never to do it in the first place.
Well told. Okay.
I agree with your students. I love this laugh.
Let's get this in one recent editorial. You got this great quote from Malcolm X, which I don't think I read the first time around. It says, you said, "I'm for the truth, no matter who tells it. I'm for justice, no matter who it is for or against." End of quote. And in what ways do those kinds of words serve as a kind of moral political guide for you about talking about these very difficult issues, about these big social cleavages in our society?
Well, I do believe it's really important for people, journalists. I mean, I'm coming from a journalistic place when discussing that, to always be in pursuit of truth. And when you are in pursuit of truth, that truth can never hurt you, right? People often ask me about advocacy, and I am quick to say I'm not an advocate. And they go, "Well, but you're advocating for this and that or whatever." I said, "No, I'm writing about it. And I'm opining about it, and I have a position on issues. But at the same time, you'll never see me at a protest. You'll never see me arm in arm in the front of a march, because you need, as a journalist, the independence to say, if you are wrong, I need to be able to call you out that you are wrong, and I don't need for anyone to second guess my motivations as to why I have not done so." People shouldn't be able to look at what I'm doing and say, "Oh, the reason he won't call this person out is because they're friends, or because they marched in this march together, or because they gave him some award or another." We don't take awards from anyone other than journalistic awards. Because you need that level of independence. And I love what Malcolm is saying, that just follow truth.
Just follow the truth. I love this. I'm going to go over some of this. Some people write long questions. This is like 2 pages here. Let me see. I wish somebody would have edited this for. It says, in your memoir, you talk about the time during high school where you were almost inhabited by God or spirituality.
Yes.
Can you talk about that? And has it ever happened have you ever accessed that again? I can't quite read that,
Okay.
that latter part of it.
Well, I mean, kind of intense spirituality. I've read about this since having that kind of experience, and that is, it often happens to kids in high school. I didn't know that. I grew up in the Deep South, the Bible Belt. Everyone's incredibly religious. And not only are we religious, we're also kind of superstitious to an incredible degree. I read about that too. You don't just go to church, you also go to the seer. You got to manage all the spirits, the good ones and the bad ones. There's all of that slushing around. And so there's in this moment where I'm about 15 years old, and I become incredibly religious. And I think part of that was my mind's way of trying to deal with tremendous levels of trauma, and trying to hand them over to something else other than me, because otherwise I was gonna go crazy. And then coming out of that and realizing that it was probably my mind's own survival mechanism. But at the same time, really kind of missing that feeling of spirituality. My son, my oldest son, when he was about 10 or 11 years old, I used to take him to church a lot, and he's like, "I think everybody here is crazy, we're the dinosaurs." He was having his moment, and he says, "I don't believe in any of this." But he said something, then he said, "But I would hate to live in a world where a God couldn't exist," which I thought was a beautiful kind of message of inclusion, to say, you can have whatever you want and whatever you believe, and I love the idea that you want that. It's just that I don't believe the same thing as you. And I've kind of adopted that. There's a part of me that says, I can't, I don't follow doctrinally, 2,000 or 3,000-year-old books, but, I would hate to live in a world where other people couldn't express their beliefs.
This is sort of an interesting follow-up question about how do you talk to your kids about race? And in particular, they want to know what you said to Taj after he was racially profiled.
Well, it was more important than what I had said to him before, like about how you deal with situations like this. And so he was able to follow that, and that was good. And I talked to them, it's very casual. Black people often say, and people ask us about this on television, we have conversations about how to deal with the police with our kids. And I think that people have some concept that this conversation is like at a big oak table and a bunch of candles and like, no, it's not. It's just like, it's constant. Like I'm like making eggs in the morning. Like, you saw that on television, you don't ever do that, It's a constant, very kind of piecemeal thing, but you're constantly saying things. And I think they're constantly absorbing it. And the dance here is to give them enough information and enough tools to survive without injuring their kind of sense of self and the value that they place in themselves. And that is a really difficult thing to do because you can clip a child's wings very quickly. And that is the part of it that is the oppression. Because if you never have to have that conversation with your kid, that is the very definition of privilege.
Mm-hmm. 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 All right. Thank you. There's a lot of good questions here, and I will share them all with Charles. But I'm going to use the last question here, and I want to talk about music for a second. Your brother Nathan pleaded with your mother to name you Ray Charles.
Yes.
And her compromise was to name you Charles McRae.
Right.
Blow.
You didn't have to get my middle name.
Let me ask you a revealing musical question that John Powell once asked each person on the Haas Institute staff. He asked them, William Smokey Robinson or Al Green, and why?
Oh, I'm an Al Green person. Oh, the why? Oh.
I don't know if we ever gotten to the why, but he did ask that.
Do we need a why? I mean, it's Al Green.
I think that sums it up. I want to thank you. Thank you very much for Charles Blow, and thank you. Yeah, Charles. You did good, Charles.
Thank you.
We had a lot of interesting questions there.